Close your eyes and imagine the scent of roasted cacao beans warming over an open fire, their earthy aroma mingling with wood smoke and the green dampness of a tropical forest. Feel the smooth weight of a clay vessel in your hands. Hear the rhythmic whoosh of liquid being poured from height to ground, over and over, until a thick foam rises like clouds. Taste the bitterness on your tongue, sharp, profound. Nothing like sweetness, mixed with ground chili peppers that make your mouth tingle with heat. This was chocolate once, thousands of years ago, before sugar ever touched it, before it crossed oceans, before it became the comfort we know. How did this sacred bitter drink of ancient priests and warriors transform into the candy bar tucked into a child's lunchbox? The answer is a story of cultures meeting, tastes shifting, and human creativity finding new ways to share an old gift. Come, let's follow the cacao bean on its long journey home. But before that, comment down below which country you're watching this video from. The cacao tree grew in a place between worlds, not quite lowland, not quite highland, thriving in the dappled shade of taller trees where the soil stayed moist and the air hung heavy with moisture. The people who first discovered what could be done with the strange pods growing directly from the tree's trunk lived along the eastern slopes of the Andes in what we now call Ecuador. More than 5,000 years ago, the Mayo Chinchipe culture made their homes in the highland Amazonia corridor, where rivers like the Chinchipe and Marañón carved paths through green mountains. There were farmers and potters, makers of beautiful ceramics decorated with intricate designs, and somehow, in ways we can only partially reconstruct from archaeological fragments, they learned the secret hidden inside the cacao pod. Imagine cracking open one of these pods for the first time. The outer shell is hard, ridged, shaped like a small football with pointed ends. Inside, nestled in white pulp that tastes sweet and slightly tangy, are 30 to 40 seeds, what we now call cacao beans, though they're really closer to almonds in structure. The pulp would have been the obvious first discovery, a quick source of sweetness, refreshing in the tropical heat. But someone, at some point around 3,300 years before the Common Era, discovered that those bitter seeds could be transformed. The process would have required patience and experimentation. First, the seeds needed to ferment, perhaps by accident at first. Left in a pile, the natural yeasts and bacteria in the air would have gone to work, breaking down the pulp, changing the chemistry inside the beans. Then came drying in the sun, the beans darkening, their flavor deepening. Roasting followed, probably over open fires, the heat releasing oils and developing flavors that hadn't existed before. Finally, grinding, crushing those roasted beans between stones until they released their fat and formed a paste, thick and dark and intensely bitter. Archaeological evidence from a site called Santa Ana la Florida tells us that the Mayo Chinchipe people were mixing this cacao paste with water and possibly other ingredients to create beverages. They stored these drinks in elaborately decorated vessels, suggesting that whatever they were making held significance beyond simple refreshment. Chemical analysis has revealed the telltale markers of cacao, theobromine, caffeine, theophyllanine, in pottery fragments that date back 5,300 years. These are stimulants, compounds that affect the human body and mind, giving energy, sharpening focus, perhaps inducing slight euphoria. We don't know exactly what these early cacao drinks tasted like. Without sugar, which was unknown in the Americas at this time, they would have been profoundly bitter. Perhaps they added honey from native bees, or mixed in fruits, or combined the cacao with maize to create something more substantial. What we do know is that this wasn't casual consumption. The effort required to process cacao, the days of fermentation, the careful roasting, the laborious grinding, meant that whatever emerged from this process mattered deeply to the people who made it. Over centuries, as people migrated northward through Central America, they carried cacao with them. The knowledge of its cultivation and preparation spread slowly, carefully, becoming embedded in the cultures that encountered it. By the time the Olmec civilization flourished along Mexico's Gulf Coast around 1,500 years before the Common Era, cacao had already been domesticated for nearly 2 millennia, but it was the Olmec who gave us the word that would echo through history, cacao, their term for the bean and the drink made from it. The Olmec left behind carved stone heads weighing tons, mysterious sculptures that still gaze across the centuries with enigmatic expressions. They also left evidence of their love for cacao. Pottery vessels from the archaeological site of San Lorenzo, occupied between 1200 and 400 years before the Common Era, contain residue that tests positive for theobromine. These weren't simple drinking cups but specially crafted vessels called tecamates, round-bodied jars that could hold the precious liquid and perhaps help create the foam that would become so important to chocolate culture, for the Olmec, and for the civilizations that followed them. The Maya, the Aztec, the Toltec. Cacao occupied a space that we, with our modern categories, struggle to define. It was food, yes, but also medicine. It was currency, but also sacred offering. It was everyday and extraordinary, practical and mystical, all at once. This complexity would stay with chocolate throughout its long transformation, echoing even today in how we think about it, as treat, as comfort, as gift, as indulgence, both guilty and divine. The Maya, who built their great cities across what is now Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula during what archaeologists call the Classic period, roughly between 200 and 900 of the Common Era, elevated cacao to the center of their cosmology. In Mayan creation stories, humans were fashioned from a mixture of maize and divine blood, but cacao was there too, woven into the story of how people came to be. The tree itself, which grows in shade, became associated with the underworld, that mysterious realm beneath the surface of things where transformation happens. In the great cities of the Maya, drinking chocolate was an art form, and the most prized part wasn't the liquid itself, but the foam that crowned it. Picture a Maya noble in the city of Palenque, perhaps around 700 years into the Common Era, preparing for an important ceremony. The cacao beans have already been roasted and ground, mixed with water and spices, perhaps vanilla from the vines that grew wild in the forest, or the seeds of the annatto tree that lent a rust-red color and a subtle peppery flavor. But the preparation isn't complete until the liquid has been transformed through a technique that required both skill and showmanship. The server, often a woman, as chocolate preparation was considered skilled women's work in many Mesoamerican cultures, would pour the chocolate from one vessel into another placed on the ground. But not just pour, she would lift the top vessel high above her head, letting the liquid fall in a long stream, splashing into the lower container with force. Again and again lifting and pouring, the liquid arcing through the air, until finally a thick layer of foam formed on top, light and airy, almost whipped in texture. This foam was the jewel of the drink, the part that tasted sweetest despite containing no sweetness. We know this happened because the Maya themselves showed us. Painted on cylindrical ceramic vessels, the tall beakers that wealthy Maya used specifically for drinking chocolate, scenes depict this exact process. Archaeological evidence supports these images. Residue analysis of these cylinder vases reveals cacao residue concentrated near the rim, exactly where foam would settle. Many of these vessels bear hieroglyphic inscriptions that translate roughly as "his drinking vessel for cacao," marking them as specialized equipment for this one precious beverage. The Maya didn't drink their chocolate hot as we might expect. The climate where they lived rarely called for warming drinks. Instead, chocolate was consumed at room temperature or even cool, the thick liquid coating the mouth, the foam dissolving on the tongue. Mixed into the ground cacao might be ground maize, creating a more substantial drink that could serve as a meal, or chili peppers, the fiery capsicum varieties that grew abundantly in Mesoamerica, adding heat that complemented the bitter chocolate in ways that European palates would later find bewildering. Cacao itself didn't grow in every Maya region. The tree requires specific conditions: rich soil, constant moisture, temperatures that never dip into cold, and crucially, shade from taller trees. The best cacao came from the Pacific coastal region called Soconusco, where the climate and soil combined to produce beans of exceptional quality. This geographical limitation made cacao inherently valuable. Cities in the Maya lowlands, built on limestone bedrock unsuitable for cacao cultivation, had to import every bean they consumed. This importing happened through elaborate trade networks that stretched across Mesoamerica. Professional merchants, called the Pochtica class by the later Aztec, traveled on foot along established routes, carrying cacao beans in carefully packed loads. These weren't casual journeys but expeditions that could take months, crossing through multiple territories, requiring diplomatic skills as much as physical endurance. The merchants who made these trips occupied a unique social position, neither quite common nor quite noble, but essential to the functioning of their society. Because cacao had to be imported and because its processing required considerable labor, drinking chocolate became associated with wealth and power. Hieroglyphic texts from the classic Maya period describe cacao being served at royal weddings, at ceremonies marking the end of calendar cycles, at feasts celebrating military victories, but access wasn't limited only to kings. The Maya middle class, scribes, successful merchants, master artisans, also enjoyed chocolate, though perhaps less frequently and in smaller quantities. For special occasions, particularly important ceremonies, Maya women had to prove their skill at chocolate making. Historical accounts from the contact period, when Spanish colonizers were documenting Maya customs, mention that in some regions a woman's ability to create proper froth was tested before marriage. This wasn't mere culinary snobbery, but recognition that chocolate preparation represented cultural knowledge, technical skill, and connection to tradition, all qualities valued in a potential family member. The Maya also discovered that cacao had medicinal properties. Ancient texts described chocolate preparations used to treat fevers, to give strength to those recovering from illness, to help with digestive complaints. The stimulant properties of theobromine and caffeine would have been noticeable, providing genuine physiological effects. A person feeling tired or weak could drink chocolate and feel genuinely revived. This wasn't superstition, but observation of real effects, even if the Maya didn't understand the chemistry behind them. In Maya cosmology, the cacao tree occupied sacred space. At the city of Palenque, in what is now the Mexican state of Chiapas, there stands a monument called the Temple of Inscriptions. Carved within it are glyphs that depict the city's queen, Cook, transformed after death into a cacao tree. This imagery of royalty becoming cacao, of cacao as a form of rebirth, suggests how deeply the tree was woven into Maya understanding of life, death, and transformation. The tree that grew in shade, that bore its fruit directly from its trunk rather than from branches, that produced beans which must die and ferment before they could become chocolate, all of this made cacao a perfect symbol for the mysteries the Maya contemplated. Archaeological excavations of Maya tombs have found cacao beans buried with the dead, provisions for the journey through the underworld. Sometimes whole vessels still containing traces of ancient chocolate were placed beside bodies. These weren't simply grave goods but necessities, suggesting that chocolate's importance didn't end with death, but continued into whatever realm lay beyond. By the time the classic Maya civilization began its gradual decline around 900 years into the Common Era, a decline driven by complex factors including warfare, environmental stress, and political fragmentation, chocolate had been central to Mesoamerican culture for thousands of years. The tradition would continue, passed to other peoples, other empires, but always carrying with it the essential elements the Maya had refined. The careful processing, the importance of foam, the sense that chocolate was more than mere food. By the time the Aztec Empire rose to power in the Valley of Mexico in the 14th century, cacao had acquired a new role that would have seemed impossible for something that grew on trees. It had become money. The Aztec capital Tenochtitlan was built on an island in Lake Texcoco, a marvel of engineering with causeways connecting it to the mainland, canals threading between neighborhoods like watery streets, and markets so vast that Spanish conquistadors would later compare them to anything in Europe. In the great market at Tlatelolco, the twin city joined to Tenochtitlan, you could buy anything the empire produced. Woven cloth in brilliant colors, jade jewelry carved into intricate shapes, obsidian blades so sharp they could split a hair, feathers from tropical birds that lived hundreds of miles away, pottery, tools, food of every description, and most of these transactions happened not with coins or paper money, but with cacao beans. The exchange rates were well established, passed down through oral tradition and reinforced by daily practice. A single cacao bean might buy you one tamale, a small but satisfying meal wrapped in corn husk. 10 beans could purchase a rabbit already cleaned and ready for cooking. A larger turkey hen cost 100 beans, a significant purchase, the kind you'd make for a feast or celebration. A piece of cloth to make clothing might cost 65 to 300 beans depending on size and quality. Even more valuable items required cacao. One account suggests that 100 beans could purchase a slave, though this grim equivalence varied by region and circumstance. This wasn't arbitrary. Cacao made surprisingly good currency because it met several important criteria. Each bean was roughly the same size and weight, making them easy to count and standardize. They were durable enough to transport but would eventually spoil, which discouraged hoarding and kept them circulating through the economy. They came from specific regions and couldn't be produced everywhere, which gave them inherent value. And, perhaps most importantly, they could be consumed. If trade collapsed, if the economy faltered, you could always drink your money. But this same consumability created a problem: counterfeiting. Archaeological sites have yielded cacao bean-shaped clay objects, carefully crafted to look and feel like real beans. Some accounts describe even more elaborate frauds. Hollow out a real cacao bean, remove the precious interior, fill the shell with sand or dirt, then carefully seal it closed. These counterfeit beans could pass through several hands before anyone discovered the deception, especially in busy markets where transactions happened quickly. For the Aztec nobility, chocolate represented something beyond mere currency. The Emperor Moctezuma II, who ruled when the Spanish arrived in 1519, supposedly consumed enormous quantities of chocolate daily. One Spanish chronicler claimed Moctezuma drank 50 cups at a time, though this number is likely exaggerated. The kind of detail that grows in the telling. What's certain is that chocolate drinking was a daily ritual for Aztec rulers, served in golden cups that were used once and then thrown away, a display of wealth that impressed and intimidated visitors. The Aztec faced a geographical challenge even more acute than the Maya had. The Valley of Mexico, where Tenochtitlan stood at an elevation of over 7,000 feet, was completely unsuitable for growing cacao. The climate was too cool, the air too dry, the seasons too pronounced. Every single cacao bean consumed in the Aztec capital had to be imported from tropical lowlands hundreds of miles away. This created both an economic opportunity and a political imperative. As the Aztec Empire expanded through military conquest during the 15th century, cacao-producing regions became prime targets. When Aztec armies conquered an area that grew cacao, the terms of surrender always included tribute, regular payments of goods sent to Tenochtitlan, and cacao featured prominently in these tribute requirements. The Codex Mendoza, a document created shortly after the Spanish conquest that recorded Aztec tribute systems, shows that the province of Soconusco alone was required to send 400 large containers of cacao annually, each container holding approximately 24,000 beans. That's nearly 10 million beans from just one province, just 1 year. These tribute payments arrived in Tenochtitlan carried on the backs of porters, as Mesoamerica had no pack animals and hadn't invented the wheel for transportation. Imagine the logistics: thousands of men walking for weeks, each carrying a carefully balanced load, following routes that had been established over generations, passing through different kingdoms and territories, always moving toward the great city on the lake. The Aztec nobility didn't just enjoy chocolate, they built an empire partly to ensure its steady supply. The way the Aztec prepared their chocolate differed from Maya traditions in subtle but important ways. They still valued the foam, still poured from height to create it, but they also introduced innovations. Some chocolate was flavored with vanilla, those long dark pods from orchids that grew in the tropical forests. Others added honey, one of the few sweeteners available in pre-Columbian Americas. Though honey was itself rare and valuable, many preparations included chili peppers or other spices that made the drink complex, layered, more experienced than simply consumed. The Aztec also expanded chocolate's medicinal applications. Their physicians prescribed chocolate drinks for specific ailments, to restore strength after illness, to treat stomach complaints, to ease fever. The Florentine Codex, a massive encyclopedia of Aztec culture, compiled by Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún around 1590, includes recipes for medicinal chocolates. One treatment for fever combined ground cacao with maize and a flowering herb called lacoxochitl. Another preparation was said to help those suffering from shortness of breath or heart palpitations. In Aztec mythology, cacao held divine origins. The god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, associated with wind, wisdom, and the morning star, was said to have given cacao to humanity. The myth told that Quetzalcoatl found the cacao tree growing in paradise and brought it to earth as a gift, teaching people how to cultivate it and prepare drinks from its beans. For this gift, Quetzalcoatl was supposedly punished by other gods and forced into exile, though he promised to return one day. This myth would have unexpected consequences when Spanish conquistadors arrived on Mexico's shores. Not everyone could drink chocolate whenever they wished, while cacao beans circulated as currency and were thus technically available to anyone who earned them. The elaborate preparation required time, equipment, and skill. Poor families might accumulate enough beans to buy necessities but rarely enough to grind into chocolate. The drink remained predominantly associated with those who had leisure and resources: nobles, successful merchants, priests, and warriors who'd earned rewards through military success. Warriors in particular received chocolate as part of their rations. Before battle, chocolate provided a concentrated source of energy and mental alertness. The theobromine and caffeine content, though the Aztec didn't know to call them by these names, genuinely sharpened focus and reduced fatigue. A warrior heading into combat after drinking chocolate would feel these effects, would fight with slightly more stamina and clarity. This wasn't superstition or placebo, it was practical use of the plant's chemistry. On the 8th day of November, in the year 1519, Hernán Cortés and his company of Spanish conquistadors walked along one of the great causeways leading into Tenochtitlan, and the world of chocolate would never be the same. The meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés has been told and retold so many times that fact and legend have become difficult to separate. What we know for certain is that the Aztec emperor received the Spanish with elaborate ceremony, offering gifts that included vast quantities of cacao beans. The Spanish, for their part, were bewildered by much of what they encountered. They had come seeking gold, had heard tales of cities rich beyond imagining, and here they stood in a metropolis of perhaps 300,000 people, larger than any city in Spain at that time. Among the many strange things the Spanish witnessed was the Aztec custom of drinking chocolate. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés's company who later wrote a detailed account of the conquest, described watching Moctezuma's servants bring him golden cups filled with a frothed drink. The emperor would take a few sips, the cups would be removed, and new ones brought. The spectacle impressed Diaz more than the drink itself, which the Spanish found utterly unpalatable when they first tried it. The problem was simple. Chocolate without sugar tastes nothing like what most modern people imagine. It's bitter, astringent, with an earthiness that can seem almost dusty. Add chili peppers, as the Aztec often did, and you have something that seems less like a beverage and more like a punishment to someone raised on the wines and sweetened drinks of Europe. One Spanish chronicler famously described it as more a drink for pigs than a drink for humanity. But Cortés, ambitious and calculating, recognized something important that his initial disgust had nearly obscured. He saw how the Aztec valued these beans, how they were stored in the royal treasury alongside gold and precious stones, how entire economic systems revolved around their acquisition and distribution. He observed that wherever cacao grew, political power followed. If these beans were valuable to the people of this land, they could be valuable to Spain. The trick would be making them palatable to European tastes. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was brutal and swift, aided by diseases the Spanish unknowingly carried, by political alliances with peoples who resented Aztec domination, and by superior military technology. By 1521, Tenochtitlan lay in ruins. The Aztec Empire had collapsed, and Spain controlled the cacao-growing regions that had once sent tribute to Moctezuma. The question became, what to do with this strange crop? Initial Spanish interest in cacao was purely economic. They established plantations, forcing indigenous peoples to work under the encomienda system, a labor arrangement that was slavery in all but name. Production increased dramatically as the Spanish demanded more and more cacao. But there remained the problem of the taste. How could you convince Europeans to desire something that initially seemed so unpleasant? The answer came gradually, through experimentation and cultural exchange in the early colonial period. Spanish settlers living in New Spain, particularly missionaries and nuns who had time and resources to experiment, began adapting chocolate recipes. They kept some elements of the Mesoamerican tradition, the roasting, the grinding, the mixing with water, but started adding ingredients familiar to European palates. Sugar was the revelation, though it would take time for this combination to become standard. Sugar itself was precious in the early 16th century, produced primarily on islands in the Atlantic and Mediterranean at great expense. But Spain had been producing sugar in the Canary Islands, and Spanish colonizers quickly established sugar plantations in the Caribbean, using enslaved African labor when indigenous populations declined from disease. Slowly, sugar became more available in New Spain, and someone, we don't know exactly who or when, thought to add it to chocolate. The transformation was remarkable. Sugar didn't just mask chocolate's bitterness. It interacted with the complex flavors of cacao to create something entirely new. The chocolate that had seemed harsh and medicinal to Spanish palates suddenly became rich, complex, almost seductive. Other additions followed. Cinnamon, a spice already familiar to Europeans, complemented chocolate beautifully. Vanilla, which grew wild in Mexican forests, added a warm, aromatic note. Some recipes included anise or black pepper. Each cook, each monastery, each household developed their own preferred blend. A story circulates, impossible to verify but revealing in its persistence, about the nuns of Oaxaca in the late 1500s. These women, cloistered in convents but often coming from wealthy Spanish families, had both the time and resources to experiment with chocolate preparation. According to legend, they were the first to systematically sweeten chocolate with honey and later with sugar, creating confections that could be sold to support their convents. Whether this specific origin is true or not, we know that nuns in New Spain did become renowned chocolate makers, and their sweetened versions were indeed profitable. By the late 1500s, chocolate had split into two distinct traditions existing side by side in Mexico. Indigenous peoples, where they still had access to cacao, continued preparing it in traditional ways. Bitter, spiced with chili, foamed through pouring. Spanish colonizers and indigenous peoples who worked in Spanish households prepared it sweet, flavored with cinnamon and vanilla, served hot rather than at room temperature. These parallel traditions coexisted for generations, each community drinking chocolate in ways that affirmed their cultural identity. The Spanish faced another challenge beyond taste: theological debate. As chocolate drinking spread among Spanish colonizers in Mexico, questions arose about its appropriateness during religious fasts. Catholic doctrine prohibited eating during fast days, but what about drinking? And was chocolate with its fat content from cocoa butter really just a drink? Or was it substantial enough to count as food? This debate grew surprisingly heated. Some priests argued that chocolate clearly broke the fast. It was nourishing, satisfying, substantial. Others countered that it was liquid, and liquids never broke fasts. The question reached high church authorities. Finally, in 1662, Cardinal Francesco Maria Brancaccio issued a ruling that became famous in Latin: liquidum non frangit jejunum. Liquids do not break the fast. Chocolate prepared as a drink was officially permissible during fasting periods. This decision removed a significant obstacle to chocolate's spread through Catholic Europe. Down from the profile of Catholic Europe, but even before this theological resolution, chocolate had begun its journey across the Atlantic. The exact date when chocolate first arrived in Spain is debated by historians. Some accounts point to Dominican friars bringing cacao to the Spanish court in 1544, accompanied by Quechua Maya nobles who demonstrated its preparation. Other sources suggest Cortés himself sent shipments back, though evidence for this is thin. What we know with certainty is that by 1585, official shipments of cacao were arriving regularly at the port of Seville from Veracruz in Mexico. These early shipments were small, experimental. Spain was still learning what to do with this strange cargo. The beans had to be roasted, ground, mixed with ingredients, prepared fresh each time someone wanted to drink it. The process was labor-intensive. The result was an acquired taste, even sweetened, and the cost was astronomical. Chocolate in Spain initially spread not as a commodity for trade, but as a curiosity, a luxury for nobles who could afford both the beans and the servants required to prepare them. For nearly a century after chocolate arrived in Spain, the rest of Europe barely knew it existed, and this ignorance was not entirely accidental. Spain guarded its cacao monopoly jealously. The plantations in New Spain and in the Guayaquil region of Ecuador produced beans that sailed only to Spanish ports, primarily Seville, where they were carefully controlled. The knowledge of how to process these beans, how to roast and grind them, how to blend them with sugar and spices to create the drink that Spanish nobility had come to crave, this knowledge too was kept close. Monks in monasteries across Spain took on the role of chocolate processors, their work hidden behind monastery walls, their recipes unwritten or at least unshared. Why this secrecy? Partly economics. Spain understood that scarcity created value, that being the sole European source of chocolate meant wealth flowing into Spanish coffers. But partly too, it was simply how knowledge travelled in the 16th and early 17th centuries. Without mass communication, without published cookbooks widely distributed, culinary techniques spread slowly, person to person, master to apprentice. The Spanish weren't so much actively hiding chocolate as simply not sharing it, the way any specialist might guard professional knowledge. In Spanish monasteries, particularly those run by Cistercian monks, chocolate preparation became a refined art. The monks developed techniques for grinding cacao beans to different consistencies, experimented with roasting temperatures that brought out various flavor notes, perfected the ratios of chocolate to sugar to spices. They discovered that adding a small amount of cinnamon enhanced rather than masked the chocolate's inherent flavors. They learned that vanilla, those long, dark pods that came from Mexico, added a sweetness to the aroma that made the drink more inviting, even before tasting it. The resulting chocolate drinks were far removed from the Aztec originals. Spanish chocolate was served hot, often almost boiling, poured into delicate cups made of ceramic or silver. The heat released aromatic compounds that filled the room with scent. Sugar, now being produced in increasing quantities in Caribbean plantations, was added liberally, transforming bitter into sweet. The foam, still valued, was created by beating the hot liquid with a wooden implement called a molinillo, a Spanish invention with a bulbous end that could be spun rapidly between the palms, creating froth without the elaborate pouring from height. By the early 1600s, chocolate had become thoroughly embedded in Spanish court life. Nobles drank it in the morning upon waking, in the afternoon as refreshment, in the evening as a social ritual. Women of the aristocracy particularly became associated with chocolate drinking. They would receive guests while sipping from elaborate cups, the chocolate serving as both refreshment and status symbol. To offer chocolate was to demonstrate wealth, sophistication and connection to Spain's imperial possessions across the ocean. But secrets, especially delicious ones, rarely stay secret forever. The turning point came through marriage and diplomacy, those traditional paths by which luxury goods and cultural practices spread between nations. In 1615, the Spanish princess Anne of Austria married King Louis XIII of France. When Anne travelled to France to take up her position as queen, she brought with her Spanish customs, Spanish attendants, and a taste for Spanish chocolate. The story of chocolate's introduction to France through Anne's marriage has been questioned by some historians. Contemporary documents don't explicitly mention it, and some evidence suggests chocolate arrived through other channels. But whether Anne personally introduced it or whether it came through merchants and travellers, chocolate definitely appeared in France during the early 17th century, and it arrived bearing the Spanish innovations, sweetened, spiced, served hot, considered a luxury suitable for aristocrats. France embraced chocolate with enthusiasm, but also with initial skepticism. French physicians, schooled in the medical theories inherited from ancient Greek scholars Hippocrates and Galen, had to determine whether chocolate was healthy or harmful. These theories, based on balancing bodily humours, classified all foods as hot or cold, dry or moist. Chocolate presented a puzzle. As a bean it seemed cold and dry, but prepared as a fatty drink it became hot and moist. Yet it was also astringent, which suggested dryness. How could it be classified? Different physicians came to different conclusions, and a lively debate ensued in medical journals and treatises. Some declared chocolate beneficial for digestion, for restoring strength to the weakened, for improving mood and vitality. Others warned that excessive chocolate drinking could overheat the blood, cause moral looseness, even lead to death in extreme cases. The Marquise de Sévigné, a noblewoman whose letters provide a vivid picture of French court life, famously warned her pregnant daughter against drinking chocolate, claiming it would heat the blood dangerously. Yet despite these warnings, or perhaps because of them, as controversy often increases interest, chocolate spread through French society, at least among those who could afford it. Coffee houses began appearing in Paris in the mid-17th century, and some served chocolate alongside coffee and tea, those other exotic beverages that were transforming European social life. But chocolate remained notably more expensive than coffee, its preparation more elaborate, its consumption more associated with aristocracy than with the bourgeoisie. From France, chocolate spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. It reached Italy, where it was embraced with particular creativity. Italian chocolate makers began adding new flavorings, jasmine, ambergris, even orange blossom water, creating perfumed variations that appealed to Italian tastes. The Medici family of Florence, wealthy merchants and patrons who'd become nobility through banking and political maneuvering, became passionate chocolate drinkers. A letter from 1677 describes Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici receiving a gift box of assorted chocolates, each flavored differently, and expressing delight at his favorite varieties. England received chocolate around 1657, brought across the Channel from France at a time when England, France, and Spain were engaged in their usual complicated dance of alliances and conflicts. A Frenchman opened the first establishment in London known to serve chocolate, located in Queen's Head Alley off Bishopsgate. The drink was advertised as having remarkable health properties. It could cure you of everything from consumption to melancholy, or so the advertisements claimed. The English took to chocolate, but in a characteristically English way. They institutionalized it. Chocolate houses began opening in London, establishments distinct from but similar to the coffee houses that were becoming popular. These chocolate houses charged an entry fee in addition to the cost of the drink itself, ensuring that only gentlemen with means could enter. Inside, men gathered to discuss politics, conduct business, gamble, and gossip, all while sipping chocolate from cups that grew increasingly elaborate and expensive. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist whose detailed journals provide an intimate view of Restoration London, mentions drinking chocolate the morning after King Charles II's coronation in 1661. He took it, he wrote, to settle his stomach after the previous night's excessive celebration. This casual mention suggests chocolate was already familiar enough to Londoners that Pepys didn't feel the need to explain what it was or why one might drink it for an upset stomach. By the late 17th century, chocolate had thoroughly established itself in Western Europe, at least among the wealthy classes. It was expensive. A cup of chocolate cost several times what a labourer might earn in a day, but it was also fashionable, medicinal, and increasingly associated with sophistication and refinement. The bitter drink of Aztec priests had become the sweet indulgence of European nobility, a transformation so complete that few who drank it in London or Paris or Madrid could have imagined its origins in the tropical forests of Mesoamerica. Yet chocolate was still only a drink. The solid chocolate bar, the candy that children would beg for and adults would hide in desk drawers for secret snacking, that innovation still lay more than a century in the future, waiting for technologies that hadn't yet been invented. In the apothecary shops of 17th century Europe, chocolate sat alongside herbs, minerals, and exotic remedies from distant lands, dispensed not as food, but as cure. The transformation from indulgence to medicine happened gradually, driven partly by genuine observation and partly by economic necessity. European physicians attempting to classify chocolate within their medical framework needed to justify its consumption to a populace suspicious of foreign novelties. The solution was to declare chocolate medicinal, and once that declaration was made, doctors and pharmacists began discovering, or inventing, ailments that chocolate could treat. The list grew remarkably long. Chocolate was prescribed to help emaciated patients gain weight, which made physiological sense given its fat and calorie content. A person recovering from fever or wasting illness who drank rich, sweetened chocolate several times daily would indeed feel stronger, would likely regain weight more quickly than without this supplementation. This wasn't placebo or wishful thinking, but practical nutrition delivered in a form that even weakened patients could swallow. Chocolate was also recommended to stimulate the nervous system of apathetic or exhausted patients. Here too, real chemistry was at work. The theobromine and caffeine in cacao genuinely do stimulate the central nervous system, increase alertness and elevate mood. A melancholy patient prescribed daily chocolate might well feel their spirits lift, their energy return. The mechanism was unknown. The compounds wouldn't be isolated and identified until the 19th century, but the effect was observable and repeatable. For digestive complaints, chocolate was thought to stimulate the stomach and improve elimination. Some physicians prescribed it for constipation, others for weak digestion. The reasoning drew from Galenic humoral theory, which held that different foods affected different organs through their essential qualities of hot, cold, dry, and moist. But regardless of the theory, many patients reported relief. Perhaps because the fat in chocolate did indeed help with regularity. Perhaps because the ritual of preparation and consumption created a moment of calm in which stress-related digestive issues could ease. Antonio Colmenero de Ledesma, a Spanish physician working in the early 1600s, wrote what would become one of the most influential treatises on chocolate's medicinal properties. His book, published in Madrid in 1631, documented the uses of chocolate in New Spain and attempted to explain them in terms European doctors would understand. Colmenero described how indigenous peoples used chocolate to treat fever, how it could relieve shortness of breath, how it strengthened those suffering from chest complaints. His work was translated into English in 1652 by James Wadsworth, and this translation spread chocolate's medical reputation throughout England. Wadsworth's preface expanded even further on chocolate's curative powers, tailoring the claims to English concerns. In an era of plague, terrible sanitation, and high infant mortality, Wadsworth suggested chocolate could help with an almost miraculous range of afflictions. It could cure agitation, reduce cancer's effects, calm anxiety, relieve asthma, restore energy, soothe sore throats, reduce fever, and quench thirst. Were these claims exaggerated? Absolutely. Could chocolate really cure cancer or eliminate plague? Of course not, but embedded in the exaggeration were kernels of practical truth. Chocolate did provide calories and nutrients to the malnourished. It did contain mild stimulants that affected mood and energy. It was prepared by boiling water, which inadvertently killed harmful bacteria, a benefit no one understood but many people unconsciously experienced. A patient drinking boiled chocolate water instead of contaminated well water would indeed feel healthier, though not for the reasons their doctor supposed. The medical establishment's embrace of chocolate served economic purposes too. If chocolate was medicine, it could be sold at apothecaries, regulated by physicians and prescribed for fees. This medical framing helped justify the high cost and made chocolate consumption seem responsible rather than indulgent. A wealthy merchant drinking chocolate several times daily wasn't being greedy or gluttonous. He was following doctors' orders, maintaining his health, ensuring he could continue his important work. In Florence, the center of medical chocolate culture in Italy, the debate over chocolate's properties reached particularly sophisticated levels. Italian physicians conducted what might generously be called early clinical observations, noting how patients responded to chocolate preparations with different ingredients. They discovered that chocolate mixed with vanilla seemed to have calming effects, while chocolate with extra chili peppers stimulated and energized. They experimented with adding egg yolks to make the drink more nourishing, or rose water to make it more cooling according to humoral theory. The Medici Grand Dukes of Florence kept detailed records of the chocolate consumed in their household, noting which varieties were preferred, which were considered most healthful. In 1671, a letter from Father Ettore Ghislieri to Cardinal Leopoldo de' Medici describes receiving a box of assorted chocolates as a gift, mentioning varieties flavored with citron, jasmine, and cinnamon, each supposedly suited to different constitutions and complaints. An unexpected controversy erupted in Catholic regions over whether chocolate should be permitted during Lent and other fasting periods. The question seemed simple. Chocolate was a drink, and drinks didn't break fasts, but chocolate's richness, its nourishing quality, made some religious authorities uncomfortable. Could you really claim to be fasting if you were sustained throughout the day by cups of sweet, fatty chocolate? The debate went back and forth for years, with different regions and different religious orders reaching different conclusions. Some priests argued that chocolate's indigenous origins made it suspect, possibly even pagan. Others countered that God had created the cacao tree just as he'd created everything else, and to reject his gifts was itself a form of impiety. The issue was finally settled, as mentioned earlier, by Cardinal Brancaccio's famous decree that liquids do not break the fast, but only after decades of sometimes heated argument. This theological controversy actually increased chocolate's popularity. Anything that provokes such passionate debate must be significant, must matter. The attention drawn to chocolate, even negative attention, made more people curious to try it. And once tried, especially in its sweetened European form, chocolate proved difficult to resist. By the early 18th century, chocolate had become thoroughly medicalized in European consciousness. Apothecaries stocked it alongside their tinctures and powders. Physicians prescribed specific recipes for specific ailments. Medical treatises debated its proper classification and appropriate applications. In 1685, French merchant and pharmacist Philippe Sylvestre Dufour published an influential guide to preparing coffee, tea, and chocolate, each beverage described primarily in terms of its health effects. Dufour's recipe for medicinal chocolate included sugar, cinnamon, chili peppers, and orange flower water to be mixed with boiled water and drunk while hot. He claimed this preparation was particularly beneficial for chest complaints, for strengthening the heart, and for improving digestion. Whether these benefits were real or imagined mattered less than the fact that respectable medical authorities believed in them and convinced their patients to believe as well. The intersection of medicine and pleasure created an interesting cultural dynamic. Chocolate was simultaneously treatment and treat, duty and delight. A patient prescribed chocolate for melancholy could look forward to their medicine with genuine anticipation. A wealthy person who simply enjoyed chocolate could claim they were following medical advice. This duality would persist even as chocolate eventually shed its medical associations and became purely recreational. There remained always a sense that chocolate was not just pleasurable but somehow good for you, beneficial, restorative. In the American colonies, Benjamin Franklin, scientist, inventor, diplomat, and businessman, became an enthusiastic promoter of chocolate's benefits. Franklin sold chocolate in his shop alongside books and almanacs, and he included references to chocolate's medicinal properties in Poor Richard's Almanac. In the 1761 edition, Franklin's fictional Poor Richard recommends chocolate as protection against smallpox, suggesting it could prevent the weight loss that made the disease so deadly. During the American Civil War, more than a century after Franklin's time, chocolate was still being used medicinally. Injured soldiers received chocolate when available, not as a treat but as medical treatment. The rich drink would help them maintain strength and recover from wounds more quickly. This practical use of chocolate in field hospitals represented a direct continuation of ideas that had emerged in Europe 2 centuries earlier. The medicalization of chocolate ultimately helped transform it from exotic curiosity to established commodity. By wrapping chocolate in the language of health, by positioning it as cure rather than mere indulgence, European society created permission for chocolate to spread beyond the very wealthy. Medicine, after all, should be available to all who need it, not just to those who can afford luxuries. This logic would eventually contribute to making chocolate more widely accessible, though that democratization would require innovations in production that were still decades away. In 1828, in a factory in Amsterdam, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten invented a machine that would transform chocolate from an expensive drink into something entirely new. The problem Van Houten was trying to solve was practical, even mundane. When you ground roasted cacao beans, you got a paste that was more than half fat, cocoa butter, as it came to be called. This fat made chocolate drinks heavy, greasy, difficult to mix properly with water or milk. A layer of cocoa butter would often float to the top, creating an unpleasant film that stuck to moustaches and beards. Van Houten, who had inherited his father's chocolate business, wanted to create a lighter, more mixable chocolate powder that would dissolve smoothly and taste less fatty. His solution was a hydraulic press, a machine that could squeeze roasted ground cacao beans with tremendous force, pressing out much of the cocoa butter and leaving behind a cake of compressed cocoa solids. This cake could then be ground into a fine powder, cocoa powder, much lighter and less fatty than before. When mixed with hot water or milk, it created a drink that was smoother, more pleasant, easier to consume. Van Houten also discovered that treating the cocoa powder with alkaline salts, a process that came to be called Dutching after his nationality, made it darker in color, milder in flavor, and even easier to dissolve. The combination of these innovations created what we now think of as cocoa powder, that brown dust that lives in pantries and gets mixed into everything from hot chocolate to cake. But Van Houten's press had a consequence he might not have fully anticipated at first. By separating the cocoa butter from the cocoa solids, he'd created two distinct products where before there had been only one. The cocoa powder had obvious uses for making drinks, but what about all that cocoa butter he'd pressed out? It was pale, almost white, with a pleasant chocolate aroma but relatively mild flavor. It melted smoothly, had a low melting point that made it lovely to work with. Surely there must be something useful to do with it. The answer came in 1847, when Joseph Fry, an English chocolatier in Bristol, had an insight that seems obvious in retrospect but was revolutionary at the time. What if you took that cocoa butter and mixed it back into ground cocoa solids, along with sugar? The cocoa butter would act as a binder, holding everything together. You could mold this mixture into shapes. You could make chocolate that didn't need to be dissolved in liquid but could be eaten directly, solid and portable. Fry's chocolate bars weren't smooth and creamy like modern chocolate. The cocoa particles weren't ground fine enough, the mixture wasn't blended thoroughly enough, and the result was grainy, somewhat dry, still quite bitter despite added sugar. But it was solid. It could be broken into pieces, carried in a pocket, eaten without preparation. For the first time in chocolate's long history, it had become a food rather than exclusively a drink. The implications were staggering. Chocolate that didn't require preparation, that needed no hot water or milk, no whisking or mixing, no special equipment. This was chocolate that could travel, that could be packaged and shipped, that could be sold in shops rather than only prepared in kitchens or served in chocolate houses. The market for chocolate, previously limited by the labor and expertise required to prepare it, suddenly expanded dramatically. Other chocolatiers quickly grasped the potential. In England, Cadbury acquired a Van Houten press in 1868 and began producing their own solid chocolate. The Fry and Cadbury families were both Quakers, members of a religious movement that emphasized simplicity, hard work, and social responsibility. As Quakers were excluded from many professions due to their pacifist beliefs and refusal to swear oaths, many turned to business, particularly food production. They brought to chocolate manufacturing a commitment to quality and worker welfare that shaped the industry's development. John Cadbury had started as a tea and coffee merchant in Birmingham in 1824, adding cocoa to his offerings soon after. By mid-century, Cadbury was focusing increasingly on chocolate, seeing opportunity in this growing market. The acquisition of the Van Houten press allowed Cadbury to produce cocoa powder that was lighter and more palatable than competitors' products, marketed as cocoa essence and advertised as pure and healthful. The success of this product funded expansion into solid chocolate production, but solid chocolate was still far from perfect. The graininess, the dryness, the way it crumbled rather than snapped, these qualities made early chocolate bars more interesting than delicious. The next great innovation came from Switzerland, where chocolatiers had been experimenting with ways to improve chocolate's texture and flavor. In 1875, Daniel Peter, a Swiss chocolate maker, succeeded in creating milk chocolate after years of experimentation. The challenge had been moisture. Milk contains water, and water doesn't mix well with chocolate's fat content. Add regular milk to chocolate and you got a spoiled, separated mess. But Peter's neighbor was Henry Nestlé, who had developed a process for making condensed milk, removing most of the water to create a shelf-stable product. By using Nestlé's condensed milk, Peter could add milk's flavor and creaminess to chocolate without the moisture problems. Milk chocolate was sweeter, milder, more approachable than the dark chocolate that had dominated until then. Children especially loved it, and the market expanded again. Chocolate was no longer just for adults, no longer purely medicinal or sophisticated, but could be a treat for anyone, including the very young. The partnership between Peter and Nestlé eventually led to the formation of the company that still bears Nestlé's name, one of the giants of the chocolate industry. The final touch came in 1879, when another Swiss chocolatier, Rudolf Lindt, invented a process called conching. Lindt's machine ground chocolate very finely while heating it gently and stirring it continuously for hours or even days. This prolonged mixing distributed the cocoa butter evenly throughout the chocolate, broke down particles to microscopic size and allowed unwanted flavors to evaporate. The result was chocolate that was smooth, creamy, that melted on the tongue rather than feeling grainy or waxy. Conching made chocolate luxurious in a way it had never been before. The texture became silky, refined, a sensual experience that justified higher prices and attracted more consumers. Lindt's process was initially a trade secret, but by the early 20th century it had become standard in quality chocolate manufacturing. Chocolate had finally achieved the form we recognize today: smooth, creamy, sweet, available in both dark and milk varieties, moldable into bars and shapes of all kinds. These innovations, the cocoa press, the addition of cocoa butter to make solid chocolate, the incorporation of milk, the smoothness achieved through conching, all happened within about 50 years, a remarkably compressed period of technological change. Each innovation built on previous ones, each opened new markets and possibilities. The chocolate that had required hours of preparation by skilled workers could now be mass-produced in factories, shaped by machines, packaged and distributed widely. By the late 19th century, chocolate manufacturing had become a proper industry, with factories employing hundreds or thousands of workers, producing chocolate on scales that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. In England alone, chocolate production rose from around 10 tons in 1852 to over 1,100 tons in 1880. Similar expansions were happening across Europe and in the United States, where Milton Hershey was building what would become America's dominant chocolate company. By the dawn of the 20th century, chocolate had completed a remarkable circle, traveling from the forests of Mesoamerica to the courts of Europe and then, transformed almost beyond recognition, returning to be consumed everywhere. The chocolate bar that a factory worker in Manchester might buy in 1900 bore little resemblance to the bitter, frothy drink that a Maya noble had consumed 12 centuries earlier. It was sweet where the original had been bitter, solid where it had been liquid, mass-produced where it had been laboriously handmade. Yet something essential connected them. The same cacao beans, processed and transformed, carrying within them that distinctive flavor that humans across cultures and centuries had found compelling. The democratization of chocolate happened gradually through the 19th century and accelerated in the 20th. As production methods improved and scaled up, prices fell. Chocolate that had once been affordable only to aristocrats became accessible to the middle classes, then to working families, then to nearly everyone. The journey from luxury to commonplace took about 300 years, but most of that transformation was compressed into a few decades around the turn of the 20th century. Milton Hershey, an American entrepreneur who had made and lost several fortunes in the candy business, visited the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 and saw chocolate-making equipment from Germany on display. Fascinated by the possibilities, he purchased the equipment and began experimenting. By 1900, Hershey had perfected a formula for milk chocolate that could be produced efficiently and sold cheaply enough for ordinary Americans to afford. The Hershey bar, introduced in 1900, cost just 5 cents, within reach of children with pocket money. Hershey built an entire town around his factory in rural Pennsylvania, providing housing, schools, parks, and services for his workers. This paternalistic approach to industrial capitalism was similar to what the Cadbury family had done in England with their model village of Bournville, built around their chocolate factory near Birmingham. Both companies believed that businesses had responsibilities beyond profit, that workers should live in decent conditions, that quality of life mattered alongside productivity. Whether this was genuine social conscience or enlightened self-interest, happy workers are productive workers. The result was that chocolate manufacturing became associated with somewhat better working conditions than many other industries of the time. The 20th century brought chocolate into everyday life in ways that would have astonished earlier generations. Chocolate became Halloween candy handed out to costumed children by the bagful. It became Valentine's gifts, heart-shaped boxes expressing romance. It became Easter eggs, Christmas treats, birthday presents. Soldiers carried chocolate bars in their rations during both World Wars, compressed nutrition that provided quick energy and a taste of home. Chocolate chips were invented, making it possible to add chocolate to cookies and creating one of America's most beloved desserts. The varieties multiplied endlessly. White chocolate, made from cocoa butter but no cocoa solids, became commercially available in the 1930s. Dark chocolate with high cacao percentages appealed to those who preferred less sweetness and more intensity. Chocolate combined with almonds, hazelnuts, caramel, nougat, peanut butter, mint, orange, chili peppers, the Aztec spicing coming full circle, and dozens of other flavors. Chocolate coating covered everything from cherries to insects, from pretzels to strawberries. Yet even as chocolate became ubiquitous and endlessly varied, some people began seeking connections back to its origins. The craft chocolate movement that emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries emphasized single-origin cacao, beans from specific regions processed in small batches to highlight their unique characteristics. These chocolate makers talked about terroir, how soil and climate affected flavor. Using vocabulary borrowed from wine culture, they sought out rare cacao varieties, experimented with minimal processing, tried to let the chocolate speak for itself. Some craft makers even returned to the Mesoamerican tradition of unsweetened or barely sweetened chocolate, creating bars that would have seemed more familiar to an Aztec priest than to most modern chocolate consumers. These chocolates found an audience among people curious about authentic flavors, about experiencing chocolate closer to how it had been before Europe transformed it. The circle was closing, in a sense, chocolate returning, however imperfectly, towards its roots. Meanwhile, in the regions where cacao had always grown, chocolate consumption remained surprisingly low for much of the 20th century. The cacao-producing countries of West Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia exported nearly all their beans to manufacturing centers in Europe and North America. A farmer in Ivory Coast, the world's largest cacao producer, might work his entire life growing cacao and never taste chocolate as most of the world knew it. This began changing slowly in recent decades as local chocolate industries developed and domestic consumption increased, but the irony remained stark. The people who grew chocolate's essential ingredient had often been excluded from enjoying the finished product. The questions about chocolate's production also grew more urgent as consumers became more aware of the conditions under which cacao was grown and harvested. Issues of child labor, unfair wages, environmental damage from unsustainable farming. These concerns led to movements for fair trade chocolate, organic chocolate, ethically sourced chocolate. The industry, worth over $100 billion annually by the early 21st century, faced pressure to ensure that the people who grew cacao benefited fairly from the wealth it generated. Yet despite these complications, chocolate retained its magic, that quality that had made it valuable across cultures and centuries. A piece of good chocolate still creates a moment of pleasure, a pause in the day, a small gift to oneself. The chemistry is well understood now. We know about theobromine and phenylethylamine, about how chocolate triggers serotonin release, about the melting point of cocoa butter being just below human body temperature, so chocolate literally melts in the mouth. But understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the experience. On a quiet evening, you might make yourself a cup of hot chocolate, whisking cocoa powder into warm milk with a bit of sugar, perhaps a touch of vanilla. As you sip it, you're connected across centuries to everyone who found comfort in this drink. To the Maya woman who poured chocolate from height to create foam, to the Spanish nun who first thought to add sugar, to the London gentleman discussing politics in a chocolate house, to the factory worker who could finally afford a chocolate bar after a long shift, to the child receiving their first Halloween candy. The cacao tree still grows in the same regions where the Maya and Aztec knew it, though now it grows in Africa and Asia too, carried there by colonial expansion. The pods still hang directly from the trunk in that peculiar way, still contain beans surrounded by sweet white pulp. Those beans still must be fermented, dried, roasted, ground. The essential process hasn't changed, even if machines now do what hands once did. In some ways, we've gained so much. Chocolate is affordable, available, endlessly varied. In other ways, perhaps we've lost something, the sacred quality it once held, the ceremony around its preparation and consumption, the sense that chocolate was a gift from somewhere beyond the ordinary world. But maybe that's all right. Maybe chocolate's greatest transformation wasn't from bitter to sweet, or from drink to solid, but from rare to common, from exclusive to shared. What had belonged only to emperors and priests and wealthy nobles became something anyone could enjoy. And that democratization, that spreading of pleasure, has its own kind of beauty. So the next time you break off a piece of chocolate or warm your hands around a mug of hot cocoa, remember that you're participating in a story thousands of years old. Remember the people who first discovered cacao's potential, who spent generations perfecting its preparation. Remember those who brought it across oceans, who argued about whether it broke religious fasts, who invented machines to make it smoother and more delicious. Remember that chocolate, like so many good things, is the result of countless human hands and minds working across centuries and continents to transform a bitter bean into something sweet. The gift the gods supposedly gave to humanity, or more accurately, the gift humanity gave to itself through patience, creativity, and cultural exchange, continues to bring moments of simple joy. And perhaps that's the best transformation of all.